Beside the stove, old Boone lifted his head and gave a low, throaty growl toward the northern wall. It was a deep, instinctive sound, the kind a dog makes when he senses something unseen creeping toward a home. Kellen Whitaker woke suddenly. The prairie wind was no longer simply howling outside. Now it seemed to be moving beneath the floorboards, a sharp invisible current, thin and cold as a January stream. He slipped out of bed, dropped to his knees, and pressed his bare palm against a crack in the floor. The wood felt as cold as iron. Near the stove, Caleb slept curled beneath wool blankets. Beside him, Miriam's eyes remained closed, but one hand rested unconsciously on her swelling belly, guarding the unborn child even in sleep. Kellen stood and looked out the window. In the pale moonlight, the unfinished ring of stone around the wooden walls looked strange and joyless against the open prairie. It was only half complete. In that moment, he understood one thing with absolute clarity: if winter arrived before the stone wall was finished, the child inside Miriam might never live to see spring. The race was no longer against stone and mortar. It was against the price of an old mistake. The Whitaker cabin had been built quickly after a dry year. Too quickly. The cottonwood logs had shrunk before the first true winter was even over. The wind found every gap. Snow slipped beneath the walls in thin white lines that melted across the floorboards by day and froze solid again after dark. Last January, ice had formed beside the bed itself. The stove had burned almost every hour of the night, yet the warmth vanished as quickly as it came, like water thrown onto dry stone. Then came the night the chimney failed. A violent downdraft drove smoke back into the cabin so fast that the lantern vanished behind a gray haze. Miriam folded over coughing in the darkness. Caleb cried, unable to draw enough air. Kellen forced the door open against the storm. Snow exploded inside, white powder racing across the floor with the wind. After that night, he stopped blaming only the cold. He began studying the way air moved. To break those invisible currents, he turned to the heaviest, most unforgiving material he could find. And that choice soon drew the attention of the entire valley. By September of 1891, the people of Black Elk Basin had begun slowing their horses whenever they passed the Whitaker homestead. Not because the cabin looked grand, but because it looked peculiar. Every few days, Kellen Whitaker appeared along the dry creek bed south of the basin, dragging another load of black basalt on a sled. The stones were heavy enough to carve deep grooves through the prairie grass behind him. Some pieces had been smoothed by old floodwater. Others had broken from shale shelves higher up the slope. At first, men gathering firewood for winter watched him in silence. Then the jokes began. They said he was building himself a stone freezer. They said he must believe rocks burned hotter than pine. Kellen ignored them. He stacked the basalt carefully beside the cabin, choosing flatter pieces for the outer face and heavier stones for the lower foundation trench. One afternoon, Wade Mercer, the rancher whose property sat 2 miles west of the basin, stopped his horse beside the rising wall and watched for several minutes. The stone shell had already reached nearly waist height along the cabin's northern side. But what troubled Wade most was not the wall itself. It was the empty space behind it. A narrow gap separated the stone from the cottonwood cabin, wide enough in places for a man to slide his hand through. At last, Wade stepped closer and frowned. "What in God's name is the point of leaving air in there?" he asked. Kellen kept working, pressing mortar into a joint without looking up. A prairie gust rolled over the ridge behind them, flattening the dry grass for a moment before moving on. Near the doorway, Miriam Whitaker stood wrapped in a wool shawl, one hand low against the child she carried. Wade looked from the unfinished wall to her face, and the confusion in his expression slowly changed into something heavier. Concern. Wade finally dismounted and approached the wall with the slow caution of a man inspecting something unstable. He pressed a gloved hand against one of the basalt stones. Even under the weak autumn sun, the stone already felt cold. "This thing will hold winter like a cellar," he said. Callan continued to work in silence. Mortar covered both his hands almost to the wrists. He set another flat piece of shale into place and tapped it gently with the handle of his trowel. Wade pointed at the narrow hollow behind the wall. Snow will get in there. Moisture will freeze. This whole shell will become a dead cold pocket. He shook his head once. You're wrapping rock around wood. You're building a tomb, not a house. There was no cruelty in his words, only certainty. Wade had survived 20 Montana winters by trusting things he could plainly understand: thick timber, sod banks, low roofs, dry fuel. Those things made sense. This did not. I've got men who could help you fill the foundation right before the first hard freeze, Wade continued. Sod and manure hold heat better than stone ever will. Near the doorway, Caleb crouched beside the pile of basalt, stacking smaller rocks into crooked little towers while Boone watched from the porch. For a moment, Wade looked at the child, then at Miriam standing under her shawl. The worry in his eyes deepened. Callan finally spoke without lifting his gaze. Cold isn't what gets in first. Wade frowned slightly, waiting. The prairie wind rolled over the ridge again, whispering through dry grass and rattling the lower stones. Callan lifted another piece of shale. The wind carries it. Years before Black Elk Basin, before the cabin on the ridge, Callan Whitaker had worked in the silver camps of Idaho as a helper under Gideon Pike, an old stonemason known for building smokehouses that stayed dry through mountain winters. Gideon never taught the way schoolmasters did. He taught with weather. On bitter evenings, he made the younger workers stand outside the sheds and hold their hands near different seams in the wall until they could feel where warmth escaped fastest, where the air felt coldest, and where it moved. One winter night, he took Callan into a small root cellar built against a granite slope high above the camps. Outside, mountain wind screamed through the pass with such force that loose snow blew off the roof beams. The sound cut through the dark like steel tearing cloth. Inside, almost nothing moved. Gideon lit a candle and set it beside the inner wall. The flame stood perfectly still. Not even a tremble. Heat survives where air is dead, the old mason said quietly. He showed Callan the thick outer stone shell, then the narrow cavity behind it, then the hidden vents placed low near the foundation and high below the roofline. Wind pressure struck the outer wall, Gideon explained. The dead air held what remained behind it. The stone gathered weak daylight and released it slowly after dark. But the true protection came from stillness. Air locked in place. Air unable to carry warmth away. Then Gideon knelt beside one lower vent and scraped moisture from a joint with his thumb. Trap damp inside these walls, he warned, and winter will turn the whole thing against you. Callan never forgot that part. Not once. The wall around the Whitaker cabin was never meant to be solid. That was the part no one understood. First, Callan dug a drainage trench nearly 1.5 feet deep along the northern and western sides. He filled the bottom with coarse gravel hauled from the creek bed before laying the heavier basalt foundation stones above it. Low along the outer edge, he built short sloping aprons and rows of stone designed to break drifting snow before it could settle against the foundation. Nothing about the work was quick. Every few feet, he left narrow breathing slots hidden low between stones. Others sat higher beneath the roofline, positioned carefully so wind could not blow straight through the cavity. One afternoon, Caleb watched him leave another opening between two pieces of shale and frowned. I thought the wind was what you were stopping. Callan sealed the side of a joint with his trowel. It is. Then why leave holes? The question hung there beneath the steady prairie wind moving across the ridge. Callan finally looked toward the narrow cavity between the cabin and the stone shell. Because trapped moisture kills slower than cold, he said. Near the doorway, Miriam stopped sewing without realizing it. She had been stitching small pieces of worn wool cut from one of Callan's old winter shirts, cloth meant for the child not yet born. For several seconds, she simply watched her husband work. The stone wall was rising around the cabin. Not tight. Not sealed. Breathing. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time that season. Boone circled the stove twice, then settled near Caleb's blankets. But even now, the old dog still refused to sleep beside the northern wall. The first hard frost came early. By dawn, a thin line of ice had formed along the lower northern seam inside the wall cavity. Kellen noticed it immediately. Moisture had gathered there overnight and had not escaped quickly enough through the lower vents. If deeper cold arrived before the joint dried properly, expanding ice would begin cracking the mortar from the inside. Worse, damp stone could start carrying cold directly toward the cabin wall. A cold bridge. He dismantled part of the section before breakfast. Chunks of half-frozen mortar fell into the gravel trench below while pale steam rose from the open joint into the morning air. Wade Mercer happened to ride by just as Kellen drove a chisel into another fresh section. The rancher watched in silence for a moment, then shook his head. "Told you," he said. "Stone sweats colder than wood." This time, the wall looked less like a plan and more like a mistake. Kellen did not answer him. Instead, he widened the lower drainage gap. Then he mixed a heavier lime blend into the next batch of mortar and rebuilt the section from the foundation upward. By noon, thin snow had begun settling lightly into the trench. Kellen stood for a long time staring at the repaired joint without moving. 2 days later, Evelyn Rohr arrived with the weekly mail wrapped in a leather satchel dusted white by the road. She studied the unfinished northern wall for a long while before speaking. Most people asked Kellen why he was building with stone. Evelyn asked something else entirely. "You're not building for warmth," she said softly. "You're building for stillness." Kellen looked at her. Really looked at her. It was the first time anyone had understood the difference. Beside the western wall, Caleb coaxed Boone into lying down on an old blanket near the newly finished stone section. The old dog circled once, then slowly lowered himself onto the floorboards and stayed there. Miriam noticed it before anyone else. Her eyes moved from the sleeping dog to the wall beside him. Then, without realizing it, her hand slipped away from her belly for the first time in a week. The first week of November arrived with a hard wind that seemed to care nothing for the labor behind the cabin walls. The stone shell was finished. It was not beautiful. It was not perfectly aligned. Some sections remained rough and jagged because Kellen had cared more for thickness than appearance. Yet every slab of basalt and shale had been placed with purpose. Even so, the structure looked more like a barricade than a home. The prairie itself seemed to shift. The birds disappeared from the ridge. The air grew heavy. Boone began pacing the perimeter of the cabin in careful circles. Even the antelope lowered their heads as they slipped down into distant ravines, sensing the storm that was coming. Kellen walked the perimeter, checking the vents, the drainage trenches, and the chimney draft. Every measurement, every observation, told him the system was ready. Or as ready as it could be. Still, the silence carried weight. The world outside felt heavy, as though it were holding its breath. That night, Kellen slept in short bursts, waking to the scrape of gravel outside, the whisper of wind bending around the ridge, and Boone's low growl echoing the tension he could feel but could not name. Nature had noticed the cabin. Not with anger. Not with mercy either. It had circled, inspected, and decided the time had come to test it. From the porch beneath a gray, dense sky, Kellen looked at the half-cured mortar joints, the jagged edges of stone, the weak moonlight, and understood fully the race that was about to begin. Every movement of wind, every rustle of dry grass, seemed magnified. The storm was patient. Calculating. Impossible to stop. All that remained was to see whether the shell he had built could survive its judgment. The first true blizzard came faster than anyone in the basin expected. It did not build slowly. It did not hesitate. It struck like an invisible wall from the north, crashing over the ridge with enough force to flatten loose prairie grass for hundreds of yards. Kellen Whitaker moved quickly. He dragged the water barrels into the cabin. He wrapped cloth around the door seams. He covered the woodpile with heavy canvas. Every motion was exact. Every action measured. Then the storm hit with its full strength. The first sound was not wind. It was the scraping of countless snow grains clawing across the stone shell like thousands of nails dragged over rock. Caleb woke sharply, his eyes wide. Boone sprang up near the stove, growling toward the chimney as if warning Kellen of what was coming. Within a minute, a downdraft pushed the first curl of smoke back into the flue. Not as violently as the winter before. Not enough to choke the cabin. But enough to confirm one thing: nature had found the first weakness to test. Kellen looked at the chimney. The lamp flame trembled slightly, but held. Then he looked toward the northern stone wall. Snow pressed against it like a living thing. Miriam pulled Caleb close and wrapped him in her arms. Her eyes flicked to the doorway, then back to the fire. Kellen understood. This was only the beginning. The battle had truly begun, and the cabin he had built would be tested in every inch of air, every seam of stone, every vent that carried warmth through the hollow space behind the walls. Around midnight, Kellen noticed the lower northern vent beginning to vanish beneath packed drifting snow. That frightened him more than the wind itself. If airflow under the cavity stopped completely, moisture would stop escaping. The lower joints would freeze solid. And once enough cold passed through damp stone, the entire wall system could begin pulling warmth out instead of holding it in. He grabbed his coat and the iron bar beside the door. The moment he stepped outside, the storm struck him from the side. Visibility nearly disappeared. White powder spun through the darkness with enough force to burn exposed skin like broken glass. Boone barked once from inside the cabin but refused to follow him into the blizzard. Kellen forced his way along the northern wall, one hand against the stone. Snow had already covered the lower vent openings with an icy crust. He dropped to one knee and drove the iron bar into the frozen buildup. Pieces broke away and vanished instantly into the howling snow. Another gust hit him so hard it slammed his shoulder into the stone shell. And there, in the middle of the white chaos, he understood something important. The cabin behind the wall was no longer shaking. The wind was striking the stone now. Not the wood. Not the seams. Not the floorboards. The shell itself was taking the full force of the storm. Kellen widened the lower vent by almost another inch. Then he set a slanted slab of shale beside the opening to deflect loose powder away from the airflow channel. By the time he fought his way back inside, his coat was white with ice. He said almost nothing. He only placed one hand on the northern wall. Then he looked at the lamp beside the stove. The flame stood steadier than before. By the middle of the second night, Caleb woke for reasons he could not explain at first. He lay still beneath the blankets, listening to the storm. Then he realized what was missing. The small tin cup hanging beside the stove was no longer rattling against its nail. Last winter, it had clicked and trembled with nearly every heavy gust. The whole cabin used to shake when prairie storms struck the ridge. The floorboards vibrated. The seams in the walls hissed. Even the bed frame creaked during the strongest blasts. Now that sound was gone. Boone slept stretched beside the western wall, his nose tucked under his tail. He no longer avoided the northern side of the cabin. Before dawn, Miriam carefully pulled one wool blanket away from Caleb's feet. It was a small, almost unconscious movement, but it was something she would never have dared during previous winters. Kellen checked the indoor stack of firewood soon after and stood there silently counting what remained. They had burned far less fuel than he expected for a storm this severe. Still, he refused to trust victory too soon. During another inspection outside the cavity, He found a thin crack beginning to form along one lower mortar joint near the drainage apron. Freeze pressure. Small. Manageable. But real. The storm had not stopped testing the wall. When Kellen returned inside, Boone barely raised his head from sleep. And somewhere before dawn, Miriam fell asleep in the rocking chair without one protective hand resting over her belly. The third day of the blizzard buried Black Elk Basin beneath a world of moving whiteness. Outside the cabin, the wind screamed across the ridge with enough force to send fresh drifts curling halfway up the lower stone vents. Snow scraped continuously along the shell in long dry waves. Inside, the cabin felt strangely distant from the storm. Not silent, but separated from it. Caleb sat cross-legged near the stove, carving shapes from scraps of pine with a dull pocketknife while Boone slept nearby, rising only now and then to shift closer to the warmth. The oil lamp burned with a narrow, steady flame. No shaking. No western draft. Even their breathing seemed different. The air inside no longer carried thick clouds of vapor with every word and exhale. Kellen sat at the table, repairing a worn harness strap in the lamp glow. Across from him, Miriam worked quietly with needle and thread, cutting pieces from one of Kellen's old winter coats to make a small shirt for the baby. None of them spoke much. There was no dramatic moment when the cabin suddenly became warm. It did not change like that. The difference was simpler. The warmth stayed where it was made. The stove was no longer fighting the entire prairie alone. The walls were no longer bleeding heat into the wind. The cabin had finally stopped giving away every bit of warmth the moment it was born. Kellen looked up once from the harness leather and watched Miriam sewing beside the steady lamp while the blizzard roared beyond the stone shell. And for the first time since he had built the cabin on the ridge, he understood something deeply enough to feel it. The house was now protecting them. Not merely holding them inside. On the fourth morning, the storm stopped so suddenly that the silence felt unnatural. Kellen had to slam his shoulder against the door before it finally broke through the packed snow outside. Drifts stood almost chest-high along the northern side of the cabin. Black Elk Basin had disappeared beneath white. No tracks. No movement. No wind. Only frozen stillness stretching across the ridge. Kellen walked slowly around the stone shell, inspecting the damage. The outer wall was brutally cold. Ice filled the mortar joints with pale white veins. Snow had packed so tightly against the northern side that the drifts seemed almost fused to the basalt itself. He pressed one bare hand against the stone. Pain shot through his fingers immediately. Then he stepped into the narrow inspection gap between the shell and the true cabin wall. The difference was undeniable. The wood felt cool, but not frozen. Nothing like the old winters, when cold seemed to push straight through the walls and settle into the bones of the cabin. Near the southern apron, he opened the lid of the rain barrel. Thick ice covered the surface, but the water beneath still moved, dark and heavy below. Boone followed him quietly into the cavity and lowered himself to the ground between the two walls, in the very place where drafts had once whistled the sharpest. Kellen stood there for a long moment, one hand on stone and the other on wood. And he finally understood that Gideon Pike had been right all those years ago. Cold survived only where air kept moving. Late that same day, Wade Mercer appeared through the drifting white snow along the ridge trail. He moved slowly through snow nearly to his thighs, exhaustion showing in every step. His face looked raw from windburn, and ice clung along the edges of his beard. The prairie storm had not spared his place. The northern sod bank around his cabin had torn away on the second night of the blizzard. Part of the roof over his grass shed had collapsed under drifted snow. Half his feed barrels had disappeared completely beneath the drifts, and the fence line he had expected to find was gone. Wade had come to see if the Whitakers were still alive. Kellen opened the door without surprise. The rancher stepped inside and stopped at once. Not because the cabin felt hot. because it did not feel under attack. No drafts whistled through the seams. No smoke hung trapped beneath the roof beams. No trembling passed through the floorboards beneath his boots. Caleb sat near the stove, quietly eating elk stew, while Boone slept stretched along the northern wall. Wade noticed the dog first. Then the lamp flame, perfectly still. Slowly, he crossed the room and placed one gloved hand on the western wall. Silence settled heavily inside the cabin. Outside, the prairie still groaned beneath softening drifts and frozen wind. Inside, the air barely moved at all. Standing there with his hand against the wall, Wade Mercer felt the first deep crack spread through everything he had trusted for 20 winters. Kellen handed Wade a steaming cup of elk broth and returned to the stove. No smile. No pride. No, I told you so. Wade sat at the table and ate slowly, but his eyes kept moving around the cabin as though he expected to find some hidden trick buried in the walls. At last, he looked toward the stove. "It isn't warmer in here than at my place," he admitted. Kellen nodded once. "It doesn't lose itself." The words settled in the room beside the sound of the fire. Wade sat there a while longer, looking at the northern wall where Boone still slept without concern beneath the steady glow of the lamp. Then he spoke again, softer this time. "The air doesn't move." No one answered immediately. Not Kellen. Not Miriam. Because they all understood he had finally reached the heart of it. That was the whole secret. Not larger fires. Not thicker blankets. Not more wood. Still air. Near the stove, Caleb slowly fell asleep with an empty stew bowl resting in his lap. Miriam looked at the northern wall, the same wall that had once turned white with frost the winter before, and quietly turned her face away before anyone could notice the tears gathering in her eyes. Spring returned slowly to Black Elk Basin. The snow retreated from the ridge in uneven scars across the prairie, revealing dead grass, broken fence posts, and dark lines of gravel around the Whitaker cabin. Water dripped endlessly from the stone shell at midday, then froze hard again each night beneath the remaining mountain cold. By then, people no longer laughed when they rode past the ridge. They looked. And they remembered the blizzard. Mercer came first. Not to argue. Not to warn Kellen that stone held cold. This time, he came with a small, worn notebook tucked under his arm. The rancher spent nearly an hour circling the cabin while Kellen worked beside the southern drainage ditch, repairing winter cracks in the mortar joints. At last, Wade stopped beside the northern wall and opened the notebook. "How wide is the cavity?" Kellen answered without lifting his eyes. "About 8 inches on the north side. Narrower on the east." Wade wrote quickly. "What angle did you cut the drainage at?" "Enough for spring melt to keep moving." "And the vent spacing?" Kellen finally set down his trowel. Then he picked up a stick and drew lines of airflow in the wet dirt beside the ditch, bending paths, drift directions, pressure points where prairie winds struck hardest during winter storms. Wade studied the sketch carefully. After that, the two men did not speak much. They did not need to. Word spread slowly through the basin over the following months. Not that Kellen Whitaker had built the warmest cabin in Montana Territory. No one claimed that. The men who visited the ridge still found the rooms modest, the stove ordinary, and the warmth controlled and practical. But they all repeated the same thing afterward. The cabin stayed still during the blizzard. That was the detail people remembered. Not roaring fires. Not miraculous warmth. Stillness. By the next winter, several ranchers began experimenting with smaller versions of the idea. Some built low stone aprons along their northern foundations to break drifting snow before it could press against the walls. Others added rough double wall sections facing the prevailing wind. A few copied the drainage trenches after noticing how much spring moisture gathered beneath old cabins. No one duplicated Whitaker's shell exactly. Most men lacked the time. Others lacked patience. Some simply lacked the stone. But the principle traveled anyway. Breathing gaps. Dead air. Dry walls. Kellen never turned the cabin into a schoolhouse. He explained things only when asked directly, usually with a stick, drawing lines in dirt or snow while wind moved over the ridge around him. Years passed. The basalt shell weathered beneath prairie winters. Gray lichens slowly spread across the lower stones. Some mortar joints had to be repaired more than once. The northern side remained scarred by drifting ice and flying gravel long after other walls across the basin had been rebuilt entirely. But the cabin endured. And Caleb Whitaker grew into a man remembering one truth more clearly than any other. What saved his family had not been a larger fire. It had been his father's understanding of how wind moved through the world. Long after Kellen Whitaker was gone, winter storms still crossed Black Elk Basin exactly as they always had. The prairie still screamed against the ridge. Snow still buried fences. Cold still searched constantly for motion, weakness, and openings. But inside the old cabin, the air remained still. :